Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our four panelists that we have for today. We have Mr. Rushern Baker, who is the president and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group and a University of Maryland professor of public policy. We have Dr. Wilmer Leon, a nationally syndicated columnist and regular contributor to many national television news programs and newspapers. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we have Ms. Judith Hawkins, who's a former judge and attorney in Tallahassee, Florida. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us today and looking forward to our conversation today. You know, we have a number of religious groups that are trying to figure out how do you go and justify what you're doing from a religious standpoint in terms of looking out for the least of these and holding up those that are in need, but then make sure that you're not violating the laws in any way. And we're starting to see some of these issues happen as it relates to religious groups that want to assist in border crossings. And we have Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who has asked his state attorney to investigate non-governmental organizations that he claims have assisted with illegal border crossings along the U.S.-Mexico border near El Paso, and it's been raising religious liberty concerns among faith-based groups and religious organizations that are trying to help migrants with medical needs and shelter. The governor believes that this is something that organizations should not be engaged in, but how do we try to make sure that people are still having an opportunity to get involved in lifting up the least of these, but in the same breath, making sure that you're not violating, the laws of the land? Bettina, when you hear some of this information and we see what we're dealing with this battle, how do we go and deal with the justification of utilizing these type of activities, but also making sure that you're being able to maintain your religious beliefs in some way?
Well, Orland, I need to be quite upfront about this one. I think that targeting a religious organization or an individual simply for fulfilling their religious duties to refugees and immigrants, that violates the First Amendment and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This whole question of how we deal with immigrants, whether they're illegal or not, goes to the heart of whether we are a humane society or not. This is a human issue. I've visited refugee camps in Greece, and let me tell you, the reality of those camps are grim. These are families with children packed together, sharing facilities with thousands of other people with no hope for the future. They're stateless. And, the same goes for what's happening on the US-Mexico border. Just in the past almost 10 years, almost 3,000 people have died. So if you're going to ask me whether this is a religious issue, I will have to say yes. It is most certainly an issue of Christian responsibility to care for society's most vulnerable people.
I wonder if this isn't a reminder of what the Underground Railroad was like in America's history. I wonder if we're not just dealing with the same old issue of the state has policies and rules that simply go against, I'm going to use the word humanity, that go against the love of people and the help of people. And wherever the core of humanity comes from, whether it's from a Christian base or just humanitarian point of view, there is a need to help. And when the state tells you that you cannot help, then there's a direct conflict with your conscience and with your expectations of what it means to be human. I don't quite think that it almost reminds me in the biblical sense of when the apostles said to the Jewish leaders, shall we obey man or shall we obey God?
Dr. Leon, you see so many different things around the world, watching things in Ukraine and in other parts, and the concept of refugees and border crossings and how religious groups come into play. I got to imagine you bump into that conversation a lot.
I do, and it's interesting because if we go, Dr. King talked to us about honoring just versus unjust laws. And he talked about just laws being those that uplift human personality, and unjust laws are those that don't. In the context of the United States argument, it's important to understand that refugees or immigrants, those crossing borders, are supposed to be given a hearing. That is international law. They are supposed to be given a hearing, and based upon the hearing, their status is then determined. So to not allow individuals coming into this country to have the hearing that that international law requires violates law. And if you want to take it back a step even further, we have to ask ourselves, why are these individuals coming here in the first place? And so if you look at the history of Guatemala, if you look at the history of Nicaragua, if you look at the history of a number of countries in the global south, what you'll find is since probably the 1956, when the United States overthrew Arbenz, it's the United States that has been going into these countries, decimating their economies for the profit of American corporations, as in United Fruit Company, and making it virtually impossible for those individuals to earn a living in their countries. That's why they're coming here. So we have to talk about this in the complete context if we're going to talk about, and not to mention, of course, the Ukrainians that are coming here and given green cards and given social access to social programs. There's another agenda at play here, particularly down in Texas, when it comes to dealing with migrants from the global south.
You know, Mr. Baker, Dr. Leon kind of touched on a really interesting point. It seems as though sometimes as a country, we have more problems with people crossing borders that happen to be right next to us, but crossing across a large pond or a large ocean to come and join us, depending on where you come from, that seems to be the case. But religious organizations are looking at this from the standpoint of, we're just trying to follow, hopefully uplifting our fellow man. And you being a former county executive, probably in a jurisdiction that had more churches per square mile than any place else maybe in the world, how do you see that conversation being developed?
No, I think everyone, the panelists, is absolutely right. You think about this in terms of both what the governor's trying to do is have a chilling effect on people carrying out their faith. What he's hoping by threatening religious organization and faith organization is that this will stop them from actually doing these things to help folks who are coming over, solely because it's a policy he doesn't agree with. There's a group of people he does not agree with. And so when the government steps in and does that, that's where you find them crossing the line into religious activity and trying to stop religious activity. Just like, he probably would have no problem having people come from Eastern Europe over here because he believes in that policy. But he has problems with people coming from south of the border. But what he really hopes is that he'll stop these things from happening. And that's where I think we have to take, a stand against.
I was listening to Dr. Leon, and my question is, yes, they're entitled to a hearing, but what do you do with them until they get that hearing? Where they're going to be housed, where they're going to be fed, where their basic needs going to be taken care of. And it doesn't seem that the U.S. government is particularly burdened to do it, or to do it at an adequate level.
Where were they being housed 10 years ago? Where were they being housed 5 years ago? This is not new. This is not novel. The United States has been doing this for 50 years. It's not that the data tells me, it's not that the reality has changed. It's that the political perception has changed. Mm-hmm. It's that conservatives have now seen this as a wedge issue, and they are now creating a fiction. And they are presenting the fiction as reality, just like voter fraud and just like critical race theory. These things aren't problems. These things don't exist as problems only in the minds of those conservatives that want to use this to fan the flames in order to have issues to coalesce around. Donald Trump talked about building this wall. It's not a problem. In fact, in Maryland, which I know Mr. Baker understands, the price of processed crab meat went through the roof about 3 or 4 years ago. Why? Because we couldn't get the labor from the global South to come here and pick crabs. There's plenty of work for people to do. There are plenty of things that need to be done. We can house these people in the places they've been housed for the last 50 years.
If we're looking at this as being really more of a policy and political conversation, it seems as though the concept of it being a religious issue, or the fact that these are religious groups, may be more of a red herring here, as opposed to it could be any nonprofit group or any group that may be contrary to what the public or that leadership may be feeling in that particular jurisdiction. Am I missing something here, or we have a little bit of that going on?
Well, my question is, if the government were doing it and doing it adequately, then there would be no need for religious groups to do it, to be identified as religious groups. And any other groups that would do it, it would just be part of the natural flow of our economy, of our humanitarian response to these issues.
Absolutely. Bettina?
And Olin, let me just clarify, let me just refocus this conversation for a moment. Remember that what we are talking about here is Governor Abbott targeting the simple act of leaving food, water, and medicine in the desert for individuals whose lives may well be in danger. I mean, we're not talking even about complicated immigration policy. And that worries me. Why is a politician targeting an organization whose stated goal is simply to live out their faith through these simple ways of providing relief to another human being? And I think we're talking about something that we really need to look closely at. I mean, this issue has been politicized. And so often, we go to our different political corners, reflexively, and we just say, argue from the left or the right. This is an issue of humanity. And, it is an inherently religious idea that we help the least of these. And so I think it needs to be seen and protected as an expression of faith.
It's an issue of humanity unless you don't see immigrants of color as human. And the governor of Texas, I would question whether he sees these individuals as human.
Well,
But I would agree, and especially what Bettina said, and that is, if you think about this, the crust of the issue is you have the governor using governmental apparatus to stop a religious organization from carrying out their faith. So this is not arguing whether the policy over immigration should come from Eastern Europe, the border, or whether you see people coming across as human or not human. It's the fact that he's using a governmental entity to try and have a chilling effect on those who are carrying out their faith. That's the problem from a constitutional issue that we have to question is, does government does not have the right to do that? And that's the difference. He can argue that people should not come here. He can go, argue with the, the Congress, but to have, and that's what he wants to do. He doesn't want to have to go in and investigate. He's saying, I will investigate you if you continue to do this. And so targeting those groups, and that's where even people who may not agree with the border policies of the United States or the Biden administration have to see that goes, you start going down a really slippery slope for government intervention into faith.
Well, Baker, I'm going to have to let that be
Abbott
the
claims
last.
to be a Christian, so you just need to ask him, what would Jesus do?
Well,
And have we not seen this before? This is not new in America.
well, why don't we let that be the last word, Judge Hawkins? But I think you guys have hit right on the point. This is not new. However, how you couch the arguments seem to be how you end up fighting the fights. Is it religion? Is it politics? Is it policy? What are you really engaged in? Bettina, I think you hit it right on the head. This wasn't even talking about immigration, but what it did, it was just talking about people wanting to leave food. And I think that's where we start to see the real confusion when you take an act and turn it into some type of political activities. So really, we're going to thank you guys for that, but looking forward to seeing where this ends. In Texas, we're going to continue with that conversation. we have drivers that have the option there of actually personalizing their vehicles with specialty license plates. This is something that many of us have seen in many different places, and in Texas, they have a lot of these different designs. In 2015, they had over 80 different license plates that you could choose from. Had all kinds of things in which it was supporting colleges, supporting universities, supporting, different types of sodas and foods and companies and things of that nature. But we started seeing a situation that came up that started to be able to cause a problem. And part of the problem was some type of viewpoint regarding a license plate that actually had the Confederate flag, and it actually was in conjunction with the sons of Confederate veterans. And what ended up happening is that we ended up finding ourselves in the courts fighting over this issue of whether or not you could have this specialty license plate that may be saying something that's offensive and calling the question out on whether or not is this government speech. Judge Hawkins, I'm sure you've probably seen some of these type of activities down there in the southern part of the United States. But when you take a look at this particular case regarding Walker versus the Texas Division of the Sons of Confederate Vets, is there something unique or any nuance here that we're missing? Or is it one of those things where somebody should have just seen this from the very beginning and yanked it off the table and just threw it out the window and we wouldn't even be talking about this?
I don't know if I'd say that, but I will say this. Justice Clarence Thomas, who's known as a conservative, voted with the liberals to have the 5-4 vote, which means if he had voted with the other side, then anybody could put whatever they wanted on their license tags, and the state of Texas would have to approve it. So Texas seems to be on the hot seat today. I think what's really interesting about this is that those who are arguing that the sons of the Confederates, sons of veterans, should have been able to have their Confederate flag on their tag are raising the issues that while we have freedom of speech, the state has an interest in what that freedom of speech does. And just as a throwout, the day before that opinion came down, we had the Charleston murders at Emmanuel AME Church. And so I want to make that observation that free speech really isn't free. There are always consequences of freedom. There are always consequences of freedom. And I think that Texas, since back in the day, they started all of this Confederate flag stuff in the state of Texas. And so maybe, just maybe, Texas is trying to distance itself from that history because it is a very divisive history in the state. And they use the terms that when it offends a significant part of the population. So if you want anything to go, which is what we would have in a unfettered freedom of speech argument, we may end up some places we really don't want to go. And so I start the conversation with that. But just as an aside, back in '77, the state of New Hampshire had live free or die on its license plate. The witnesses objected to it. And the Supreme Court decided that the government could not make citizens be a billboard for the state's ideological messages. I think we've got the flip side now, where the flip side is that they don't want the people's individual tags to be the citizens' ideology message. So there you go.
Dr. Leon, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I'm surprised that the Supreme Court took the case in the first place, because I think it was the Pleasant Grove case in Utah that gave the holding that Utah did not have to put some religious small monument in a park because the state had an interest in speech. This is a matter of, should white supremacists be allowed to put anything on their license plate that they want to? And last I checked, the Confederacy lost the war. So the United States is the only country that I know of that the losing side still has visibility in the public space. Try to do this in Germany as a Nazi, and you will be arrested and imprisoned because it is illegal in Germany to display this type of propaganda. So The Sons of Confederacy, like, this is in the broader context, in my humble opinion, this is a matter of, should white supremacists be allowed to demonstrate their symbolism? And the answer is no. They lost the war. And for Alito, in the dissenting opinion, to talk about common usage, I mean, he was really stretching for something there, trying to, well, common usage, and people do this all the time. That's never been a constitutional rationale for doing anything. And final point, you can't put anything on your license plate that you want to. There are certain words that you are not allowed to use because they are considered to be vile, they are considered to be profane, they are considered to be curse words, and the state does not have to allow you to put that type of terminology on your license plate. The Confederate flag, in my humble opinion, falls into the same category.
If I can follow up on that, I blame you, Orlin, for choosing this case for us to discuss free speech around, because it is such a repugnant symbol, and one which, if I had my way, it would never appear in public. But I do have legitimate fears for free speech in our country. And moreover, because free speech and religious freedom are so tightly intertwined, they either exist together or they don't exist at all. They're reliant, religious freedom is reliant on a robust free speech. And so what I see, and I'm not talking about this case specifically, but in general, there is a growing discomfort in America with uncomfortable speech. And it's a progressive phenomenon, and it's a conservative phenomenon. Some on the left would like to characterize any public expression of a traditional understanding of human sexuality as hate speech. They want to do that. On the right, you have all these anti-CRT laws being introduced, trying to control ideas and the free discussion of ideas, even beyond, K through 12 curricula. And so we have this growing phenomenon on both ends of the spectrum, trying to erode America's very robust heritage of free speech. Now, in this particular case, what can you say? It's a terrible symbol, but let's not let it blind us to this other, I would say, danger that we are facing in America today, that we are moving away from our, from what makes us different to so many other nations around the world, and that is our willingness to fight for the right of other people to say things that we find profoundly offensive.
Well, Mr. Baker, I got to ask you this, though. I see more offensive things sometimes in those things that surround the license plate than that's actually on the license plates. So, as we kind of go through life in the society that we live in right now, Bettina hit the point of whether sometimes it should be all or nothing. Maybe as it relates to something as simple as a license plate, maybe it should be nothing. And maybe we just keep it basic, and you got these other ways you can express yourself, but maybe that shouldn't be it. What is so special about this from a license plate perspective?
No, I think Bettina just hit it right on the head, and that is, it's not just about the license plate; it's about free speech, and in the forms you can have. It could be your license plate, a billboard, anything like that. I think that this particular case is an easy one because it's so repugnant. You're talking about the Sons of, Confederacy. You also put it, as the panelists put it in perspective, what was going on in the country. But the thing that worries me, both as, a former legislator and, as someone who reveres the Constitution, is that we have to really look at free speech in a strict scrutiny type of way. We want to make sure at the same time that we're, taking out those things that are repugnant to the society as a whole, but also leaving an opportunity for people to be able to express themselves. There are things that people put on their license plates that I think are stupid or may personally find offensive, but they're not generally seen as, inciting a riot or mayhem or things like that. So we need to put limits on it, but we need to be very, very, very careful of where we go down, because it won't be the Sons of Confederacy we'll be talking about. it will be an expression of your faith, that is offensive to those who don't have any faith at all or agnostic. And so why should I see anything on that has a reference to God or religion or to who I am? And I think that's why we have to be really careful about these things.
I'm going to have to let that be the
Well,
last word on that, Mr. Baker, because I think that this is a topic that we could be talking about forever. But I think as we kind of wrap up this segment, the real idea with all of this is that when we get to a point where we are now allowing whatever we put out there to be offensive to people in a way that a broader society should understand, that's the type of thing we probably need to step away from. And there's no positive to that at all. So we'll see where these type of topics go in the future. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Orlin, speech in America wasn't always as free as it is now. Did you know that under the 1798 Seditions Act, it was actually a crime to say something scandalous about the government? And in fact, one of the first people to be prosecuted under the law was just some guy from Philadelphia who made a joke about President John Adams.
Wow. Judge Hawkins, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know as recently as January of 23, Texas said that you couldn't get a license tag saying that you love tofu because the last two letters kind of indicate improper speech?
Dr. Leon, tell me something I don't know.
I'm going to give you a prediction for the future. Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee, and Robert Kennedy Jr. will be the Democratic nominee for the 2024 presidential election.
Wow, that's a big one. And Rashawn Baker, tell me something I don't know.
That's a hard one to go after. Did you know that the legend of Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church is just that, a legend? Talking about free speech.
Wow, didn't know that one at all. Well, listen, ladies and gentlemen, it was great having you here with us. Great topics today, and looking forward to talking in the near future. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.